Good evening, everyone. Welcome. My name is Eric Lupfer. I am Executive Director of Humanities Texas. I'd like to welcome you to this program this evening on behalf of Humanities Texas. If you're unfamiliar with Humanities Texas, we're a private nonprofit organization based in Austin that serves as the state affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities. Our mission is to promote the humanities and humanities education statewide, and we do so through a wide range of programs. As some of you know, we hold in-person and online workshops for Texas teachers. We circulate traveling exhibitions. We award grants to organizations throughout Texas. We run a story time program promoting family literacy. We also have a wonderful reading and discussion program for veterans and their loved ones. We also hold lectures and discussions, as we're doing this evening. Tonight's program is the third in a series that we are holding this year in partnership with Texas Foodways. So I'd like to just say once again, welcome, and we're so glad to have you here tonight. One housekeeping note before we begin, please use the Q&A feature with any questions that you have, the Q&A feature in Zoom, I should say, with questions over the course of the presentation. We will address those questions at the end of the presentation. So now I'll pass the mic, so to speak, over to my co-host Marvin Bindola of Texas Foodways. Marvin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Eric. My name is Marvin Bindley. I'm the director of Foodways Texas. We're a member-supported program in the American Studies Department at the University of Texas, Austin. As a program, we seek to preserve, promote, and celebrate diverse food cultures of Texas, and we do that through oral history interviews, lectures, and events involving food and culture, the people, basically. I'd like to thank all of you on behalf of Foodways Texas and the American Studies Department at UT for joining us this evening. I'd also like to thank Eric and the crew at Humanities Texas for including us in what is sure to be an important, interesting, and illuminating conversation. It's also one that we're all likely to leave craving delicious foods that we hear under discussion this evening. I have the pleasure tonight to introduce both our guest speaker, Adán Medrano, and our moderator for this evening's program, Cecilia Ballí. Thank you both for joining us this evening. Adán is a chef, a writer, and a filmmaker. He is a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America and has showcased his recipes at national gatherings of the National Association of Latino Arts and Cultures, at restaurants like Brennan's in Houston, at the CIA restaurant in San Antonio, and at the American Book Center in Amsterdam, among others. He's the author of Truly Texas Mexican, A Native Culinary Heritage and Recipes, and his most recent, Don't Count the Tortillas, The Art of Texas Mexican Cooking. Adán Medrano is also an award-winning filmmaker and holds a Master of Arts degree in radio, television, and film from the University of Texas at Austin. In 1976, he founded the San Antonio Cine Festival, the first and now longest running Latino film festival in the United States. And of course, our reason for tonight's program, his recent documentary feature film, Truly Texas Mexican, won Best Documentary at the New York Independent Cinema Awards. And I want to, on a personal note, I met Adán not long after his first book came out, and he graciously gave us a demonstration from that book at one of our symposia that we hold annually. And this one happened to be in San Antonio, and it was, you're in for a treat tonight. This is going to be fun. Thank you for joining us this evening, Adán. Appreciate it. Our moderator tonight is Cecilia Ballí, a journalist, cultural anthropologist, and consultant. She has conducted research and written stories about Latinos and the US-Mexico border for more than 20 years. She's also been a writer at large at Texas Monthly since about 2000, and has published in other highly regarded media outlets, including Harper's Magazine, the New York Times, the Columbia Journalism Review, and the San Antonio Express News, also among others. Cecilia was an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Texas at Austin, where she was affiliated with the Institutes on Mexican American Studies, Latin American Studies, Women's and Gender Studies, and Human Rights. She left academia not too long ago to focus on writing and consulting, but is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Houston's Center for Mexican American Studies, and also an affiliated researcher at the University of Texas at San Antonio's Urban Education Institute. Welcome, Cecilia. I want to thank you both for giving us your time and expertise this evening. I think now, though, we're going to view the trailer for Truly Texas Mexican to lead into our conversation this evening. Thank you.
This would be a celebration of the American roots. Oh, tienes nopalitos. The Culinary Institute of America, they weren't doing my food. It just wasn't there. It was invisible, nothing.
It was a way for me to bring something tangible from things that are common.
We need a cow's head, una cabeza de vaca.
Say, we've got it.
Even my friends freak out. I think one of them threw up once.
This is survival food for us.
The Texas Mexican cuisine gives you an opportunity to see how differences are embraced. I'm often asked, do you like Tex-Mex food? We never ate Tex-Mex food at home. Enough with the cheese. Tex-Mex it's by Anglos, for Anglos.
The chili queens of San Antonio were in all the plazas in the center of the city. These women have to be recognized for their business smarts.
Este es un postre que se llama jericaya.
Oh, that's nice. Very, very nice.
You cannot buy the love that goes into cooking. You just can't.
You make it good, like grandma used to make it. I bring them memories. It's comida casera, just like home.
Para mí la cocina es convivencia con la familia.
Y digo familiar, no nada más mis parientes, ¿verdad? Siempre se crea un ambiente muy bonito.
Native people in the state of Texas are the forgotten people, period.
We live in a racist society, sadly. If we look to the books, we're not there. We have been erased.
The fence, as innocuous as it looks, is really kind of a death symbol.
Your ancestors have been standing here, breathing this air for 10,000 years. And that's got to be empowering.
Cooking is part of art activism because it's part of our culture, and I want to keep it up.
Her voice is in the winds. She's talking to us. She's sending us a message. Now we've arrived. We're telling our story.
I hope it's a story that is about becoming what we can become.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much to Humanities Texas and Foodways Texas for inviting us, inviting me to get to ask questions of this great mind that's with us today. I met Adán Medrano a couple of years ago. I know some of you who are attending have known him for a long time. He has a long history across various fields, including filmmaking and television and news production, and also grant making. But when I met him, what I love about Adán is that whatever you ask him, he takes every single question very seriously. He pauses, he thinks about it, and then sometimes he even questions the very foundation or premise of your question. And I think, Adán is a revolutionary thinker who is changing the paradigms and the way that we think and talk about who we are and about ourselves as Mexican Americans in Texas. So it's a great pleasure to get to engage Adán in some dialogue before we open up to all of your questions at the end. Another reminder to please drop your questions in the Q&A, as we can track them there better than in the chat. But Adán, I wanted to start just with you telling us a little bit of your story, the story of you and your kitchen, and how and why you cook. When did you start cooking, and what drew you to it?
Okay. I'm glad you're starting with that question, because this is all about how I personally cook. It's the way I cook. Many people cook differently. But I do want to thank Humanities Texas and Foodways Texas also, as you did, for this opportunity. I think it's a great opportunity for a conversation. My love of food has been always with me. My kitchen is guided by my mom's cooking and my grandmother's cooking. I say that the culinary compass of my kitchen is my mother's kitchen. And the earliest memory I have of that food is formative in terms of my identity. I remember I was 5 years old, and I often say this, sometimes you remember things that you think, why would I remember? I'm so young, but I do remember this. I was in the corner of the kitchen, it's winter, And she took a tortilla, a freshly ground masa corn tortilla, and she cooked it, and she rolled it into a little cigar. We call that machito. And then she sprinkled water to moisten it, and then she gave it to me. And I remember that it's this offering, it's this formative thing. And I know what roasted corn should taste like, should smell like, the texture around your mouth. This is how flavor profiles are created. But it's also her giving it to me. It's an embodied experience, the mother feeding. So that's formative of what I do.
Well, and starting right off, you're talking about food as something that's integral to our relationships, to our memory, and to our identity. I wanted to have you explain a little bit to the audience. There was this provocative headline in a New York Times article a couple of years ago that featured your work and your arguments that captured it perfectly. And the headline was, "Don't call it Tex-Mex." And so we know, people love Tex-Mex, including many of us. Tex-Mex food is kind of migrated beyond Texas. It's sometimes served in Europe, overseas. But you're saying Tex-Mex is something very specific. And we have lumped under that category all this other food that perhaps you consider more rich, that you are calling Texas Mexican cooking or comida casera. So can you start by telling everybody a little bit about how that Tex-Mex category and language was created, and how you conceptualize Texas Mexican cooking as something different?
Okay, yes, that is when the New York Times came out with their front cover in the food section, and there's this, "Don't call it Tex-Mex." I said, oh my God, I would not have thought that, but that's the title they chose. How shall I say this? Mira, to make a distinction is not to disparage. The first time, right before the October before the April, when the New York Times story came out, the October before then, Tim Carman from the Washington Post, who is from Texas, wrote and made a mention in his column of my book. And he put it very clearly, very well. He says, both are good. They are different. And we haven't known that they're different in this book and so forth. So I think he said it very well. After his mention, then other writers started to write about it. I would say it this way. The comida casera is what my mother taught me, her grandmother taught her, and it is a direct line from the first people to step on Texas soil. That's our ancestors, the first Native Americans of Texas, Coahuiltecas, Carancawas, all of these names. And it also has a flavor profile that has developed over centuries from the local products of this region. Tex-Mex is a different history and a different flavor profile. Tex-Mex begins in the early 1900s when, anyway, that's another story. It has a different beginning, and it's mainly known for cheesy combinations, lots of fried things, lots of cheese, and then they use terms like 3-alarm chili, 5-alarm chili, those types of things. So that's not our food. We never ate that way at home. So.
And it was specifically a category created or written about by Anglo or white food writers, correct? I mean, at the time, yes, there weren't Mexican-American voices that were participating in the conversation about what to call a food, correct?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that from our conversation, Cecilia. That's so important. We did not, nor we do today as much as we ought to, have access to the means of communication and to the centers of communication. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of the problem, that we have not, our stories have been erased and in the public marketplace of ideas. But they haven't been erased in our homes, in the intimate spaces of where we live, where we celebrate our food, our families. It's been going strong for all of these centuries. So I really wanted, the reason I wrote the book, I noticed that it wasn't known, and it's so delicious. I wanted to share it. Everybody just knows Tex-Mex, but I thought this is so much more, in my estimation, nuanced, and its histories, and it's so tied to the land. Tex-Mex doesn't do cactus. Cactus is very central to our food and other things.
Do you want to show us for a moment a map of how you conceptualize the Texas-Mexican region, and what are some of those original contributions from Spanish ingredients in foodways and indigenous ingredients in foodways?
Okay, that's great. I would love to do that. And I can't wait for the questions, because this is, before I go, I'm going to start sharing the screen, but before I do that, let me say that the term Tex-Mex is not defined. But what I mean is, in the film, I say, I've often asked, do you like Tex-Mex? And I have two answers to that, because there are two understandings of Tex-Mex. The one I just explained, but if you talk to some of the Mexican-American cooks who do public speaking, this is the only term they know. They haven't heard or coined comida casera, Texas Mexican. So they use the term Tex-Mex to refer to our food. My intent is to see that they're different. Call them what you will, they're just different, and we should enjoy them. I'm going to screen share. This is the map of 1824 Mexico. And as you can see, the state of Coahuila, Tejas is where San Antonio is, where I was born. And much of Chihuahua, Coahuila, Nuevo León, Tamaulipas, which is Mexico now, was Texas. And if we go a little bit closer into this, this is the region that I call the Texas Mexican region. And what I mean by this is that within this triangle, if you were to travel south of the river, north of the river, west and south, the food would be the same. This is a region that has a cohesive cuisine where the ingredients are the same, the techniques are the same, because people living in Monterrey would travel to San Antonio easily during that time. And so the food has become a cohesive Texas Mexican regional cuisine, our comida casera. And it's very similar to the other regional cuisines of Mexico. There is not just one Mexican cuisine. There are many Mexican cuisines. You've got Oaxaca Mexican cuisine, which is known for moles. And it uses many of the larger Mexican gastronomy. It is within its region very Mexican food, which is known for their birria, for their pozole. You've got Sinaloa, Sonora Mexican food, known for the thin tortillas. And you've got Texas Mexican food. In 1824 and before, this entire region that we now call Mexico and South Texas was very communicated. And so that's what I'm simply saying. We are simply another expression of the larger regional cuisine. And it's tied to the land, it's tied to the waters that we have, and it's tied to our history. I'll show the native articles that we have. Corn, sotol, beans, and tomatoes are native to Texas and northeastern Mexico. The tomatoes coming up, so the beans. So all of this was present much before European contact. But when the Europeans came, the Spanish were first, they brought in wheat, milk, onion, lard, among others, but these are central. So in the 1500s, 1600s, our cuisine changes to bring in these, but still maintaining the flavor profiles and the character of the region. Just like Oaxaca, their mole is thickened with bread sometimes, but it still maintains its identity as a regional cuisine. Likewise with the meats. Before the arrival of the Europeans, we had deer, turkey, buffalo, and quail. Quail, by the way, is 15,000 years old on this land. And when the Europeans arrived, the imported immigrant ingredients are cows, pigs, sheep, and goats. And so this is just like an overview of the cuisine that we're talking about. It is really indigenous, native, but it's also immigrant imported. But the character of it is the Mexican food of this region, just like Oaxaca is the Mexican food of that region. Let me stop sharing, and I'll go to the participants too. Anyway, that's a quick overview. Yes. I'm glad I had those slides.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think that map is provocative also to a lot of Texans, is to have to go back further in our origin story, say, well, there was once a time when geopolitically this was part of Mexico, And so in fact, this is one of the regional cuisines of Mexico. But then going, and so I love this conceptualization. You have a food that it's tied to the landscape. It's constantly evolving. It has to do with the encounters of different peoples, but it always responds to that local aesthetic and those local foodways, right? But I like another intervention that you're making, which is around the term Tejano. I'm someone who has studied Tejano history and culture for a long time as an anthropologist. And in that space, we tend to think of Tejano as a term that denotes the Spanish colonial ancestry. Spaniards came to what is now South Texas and northern Mexico, intermarried, became Mexicans, became Texas Mexicans, right? And you're saying actually the term Tejano goes much further back than the Spaniards, correct?
Yes, yes. We chose the title of our film to be Truly Texas Mexican because we wanted to highlight Texas Mexican. Texas is Tejas. When you write Mexico, Mexico, if you were to read it in Spanish, it would be Mexico, but you would still use an X. But in English, we say Mexico. Likewise, Texas, you say Texas in English, but if you write it with an X, it's in Spanish, you would pronounce it Tejas. And so we wanted to say that we're going back to the indigenous meanings of these terms. Tejas from the Caro Indians, who are from East Texas, a very advanced civilization, and Mexico, the Mexicas. So both of these, the roots are Native American. And there is the letters that we begin to see Tejas are the one in 1676 is from the Bishop of Guadalajara. And he describes a kingdom. This is a letter to the king in Spain. So the king will know, this is reconnaissance. So the king will know that in East Texas, there is this kingdom and it's Tejas. And the people are Tejas. And he describes that they're very powerful, that the Coahuiltecan neighbors talk about them. And then in the other documents they're mentioned. So I wanted to go to that. We know what the Caro Indians, the Tejas Indians cooked. We know that they farmed. And there is now, thankfully, the Texas Commission, Historical Commission has a museum in just a bit north, about an hour and a half north of Houston, the Caro Mounds Historical Museum. And they're the original mounds of that civilization. And when the Caro people, the Tejas people, were driven out of their land around 1680, they were transported and moved to Oklahoma, where they live now. But once or twice a year, they return to these mounds as guests of the museum, and they celebrate their food and their history. So I think all of this, Cecilia, is about how will we make new encounters today? The film talks about the encounters of conquest. I encounter the other to take advantage of, to be self-aggrandizing, to get what I need. The Spaniards saw the salt lake in Raymondville, Texas, which is in the film. We walk on this beautiful salt lake. It's wonderful. The Spaniards see it and they take possession of it. And before, it belonged to the tribes and to the land. So people would come in, take the salt that they needed, and they would come all the way from central Mexico. And this was the economy, a different understanding of what economy is. And but when the Spaniards arrived, they cordoned it off and they said, this belongs to the king, since it's a mineral and all mineral rights belong to the king. If you want some salt, you're gonna have to pay for it. So my question is, what is the new encounter? That's what it brings up, a new encounter between people.
I love that. And it also, you were saying the other day that we were talking that it challenges our definition of food and identity based on geopolitical lines. And when you look at food instead, you're talking about, as you said, about encounter and about movement. Do you want to reflect or share anything more about that?
Yes. I'll share a negative, very emotional, difficult thing, and then talk about it. What I'm referring to is identity, memory, and how we have been erased, and we have been erased. here's what I mean by that. Most of the people, when they talk about Tex-Mex, they have a worldview that says, this is the Rio Grande right here. And above, you've got Anglo-Texan culture, American culture, hamburgers, ketchup. And as soon as you cross down the river south of the border, you've got Mexican culture. And Tex-Mex is the fusion of these. The Anglo-Texans, cowboys, they saw the Mexican culture, they made it into their own. This is the fusion of these two. This is the world view. And what I'm saying, Texas Mexican food, if you look at it, puts that worldview in crisis, because you realize that the river, it may be a border now, but to birds who take seats from one side to the other, they're not going to stop at the checkpoint, nor are the armadillos, nor are the raccoons. And so to me, geopolitical understandings of food limp. It can only go so far because you can't understand the food. Basically what happens is, if you look at the landscape of the map that I showed, the different regions, look at them as land, look at them as earth, the earth blossoming to feed human beings. I mean, that's why they call it Mother Earth, because it's like my mother giving me, this tortilla. My mother is feeding me. Our earth is feeding us. So in Oaxaca, Mother Earth is providing specific flora, fauna, and we take that's what we used to cook. And as you move, to Puebla, to other things, to other regions, the same happens. And then when you move to Texas, the same happens. So the rise of, let's say, chile con queso, nachos, enchiladas, all of these are born both south of the Rio Grande and north of the Rio Grande at the same time, because we were the same people moving about. And the sort of dark thing that I want to mention is this marriage between the imported ingredients and the native ingredients is not a happy blending. This was through conquest, through dispossession, and through violence. Our cuisine is born of dispossession. And we have suffered great injustices, raping, taking us away from the land, being moved from Caro to Oklahoma. All of this pain is with us. And I will share that I have been known to be angry. It doesn't happen often. I think in the last 10 years, maybe twice it's happened. When I get so angry that we've suffered so much, and yet we are not understood, we're erased, and we have to work so hard to say who we are. And when we say who we are, our voice is taken away by writers and organizers who speak for us. And so in those instances where I have been I've gotten angry, I apologized. I apologize for the interpersonal anger, which is not a way to resolve things, but I do not apologize for the just anger of our community for what has been done. And reconciliation must happen. You can't just pretend that it didn't happen. It did happen. What do we do now? That's the ethical question. And it's a process for Texas to do that. But that's another show.
It's not, it's very much at the heart of this. And I think, it's taken this long, not just since 1848 when the river became the international boundary, but as you say, since the 1600s, 1700s, when Spaniards arrived, it's taken this long for these voices such as yours and this kind of point of view to enter anywhere. I was going to say to enter the mainstream, but just to be heard, period. And for us to be setting the terms and the conversation. What you said about music, about food, reminded me a lot about music too, like conjunto norteño music on both sides of the border that flourished at the same time on both sides and in conversation with each other, and documenting and embodying that clash of culture and the racism, but then also the kind of beautiful expressions of identity and culture that emerged from that encounter, even the violent encounter, right? But you said something very beautiful the other day that I wanted to share with everyone. You said food has no nationality, it simply has roots and it becomes rooted. And I felt like that was a beautiful metaphor for people as well, that people do not have nationality, they have roots and they become rooted. But I wanted to, being mindful of time, ask you about why you decided to have so many women protagonists in your film. It's mostly a lot of women speaking for the food, and that was a very conscious decision of yours, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about that.
Okay, yes, thank you. The film is an Amazon Prime movie. It's being distributed worldwide in both English and in Spanish, and it's on Amazon Prime, YouTube, Apple TV, Google Play. It's got really strong distribution, thankfully. And one of the strengths of the film is that it recognizes that women are the engineers of cooking technologies that we use today, and they are the creators of the flavor profiles and the taste traditions that we celebrate today. Like the mixing of spices, the combination that I call the Texas Mexican trinity of spices: garlic, comino, black pepper. You put them in a molcajete. Women invented these things and they have been erased. So when we did the film is based on my two books. So the people who appear in the film are in my books, and I contacted them because I knew they could talk about the food. They know it, and all of them are women. All the chefs we interview are women. I didn't mean to say we're going to have only women, but they were the ones who knew how to talk about it because they understand it. And so that's why women have been erased from the history of food. If you look at not just Texas Mexican, but most other cultures, women are in charge of food. They do all the cooking. You know, they know which plants are poisonous, which are not, what you serve. They created all of these things, but yet all the famous chefs are men. And I know it's the irony of me saying that, because here I am, a man saying this, but that's why they're in the movie. Not because we said they have to be women, because they're the ones who know.
Mm-hmm. But I love what you say about how it's women's work that has been taken for granted, including developing these cooking technologies and flavor profiles, which is no small contribution. So it's not just that women are in the kitchen feeding, taking care of the family and feeding. They are creating, they are doing they're the creative agents in all this.
Creative agent is the right term. Mm-hmm. And when history stops, this Alston Tom says this in the movie. May he rest in peace. Alston Tom passed away last June. A dear friend, a champion of Native Americans in Texas. He says that if you are unable to access the richness of the depth of history, and you only go back to your grandparents or your great-grandparents, you're missing out of who you are on this planet. So it's really important to have the entire picture.
Mm-hmm. Before we open up for questions, I wanted you to tell us a little bit about your experience making the film. I know you worked on it for a long time. And for some context, you've been researching this subject since around 2010, when you were at the Culinary Institute of America in San Antonio, and realized that no one was talking about or advocating for your food, your people's food. And so for many more years than you worked on this film, you have been doing what I call ethnographic research and roaming around talking to archaeologists, anthropologists, home cooks, restaurant owners, chefs. And then you decided to work on this film. Can you tell us why you decided to use that form to tell this story and what it was like? I know you were in San Antonio, Houston, the Valley. It was a lot of travel, Corpus Christi.
Yes, and on a boat on the Rio Grande. Yeah.
Define the boundary itself.
So in every one of these places I get fed, and one of my friends was saying, this is a scam. You're just going around because you want to be fed delicious food. It's a scam. I think the core of the film comes from the coming together of four people: the director, the cinematographer, and the producer. We were together for 9 days in a van, and we shot the entire film, which is an hour and a half, We shot it in 9 days. And the producer is Virginia Diaz Laughlin. Virginia Diaz is born in San Antonio, lives in Houston, and I think is one of the unsung stars of the feature film and television industry of Texas. She was the co-location manager for the feature film Selena. She has other feature films under her belt. So she was great. She and I didn't know one another. We were introduced by the Houston Film Commission. When she saw the book and I asked her would she be interested in working, she said, yes, this is my food. You're taking pictures of my food. This is what my mother gave me. And the director is Aníbal Capuano from Uruguay. I had known him before, and he read my book and he said, this is an international story. Your story about the Texas Mexican-American families and talking about their native food resonates with the indigenous communities in Colombia, Uruguay, Argentina, everywhere. So I agreed. And then the cinematographer is a friend of his with whom he had made other films, a much sought after cinematographer who's brilliant. Well, you'll see in the film how beautiful. What he does, he captures the South Texas landscape in a way that no one else has. Nopalitos, dunas, mesquite. He just captures the land the way it's supposed to be, the source of food. So it was an interesting 9 days. We shot 29 hours. So thanks to all of them, they deserve a big, big credit. And then when we returned with the footage, we were lucky to have Bill we see him in the film, Bill, who is the editor and the sound man, and others who came.
Yeah, and it's a great film in my view because it's very different from a typical food film in that, well, I don't know that there's a typical food film, but what I like about yours is that it brings not just food, but history, anthropology, politics, and you don't want to shy away from any of that. You wanted to have your own take on what it is to explain food and to explain place, right? I highly recommend it. It's very beautiful. It'll make you hungry. It'll make you homesick. It'll make you want tacos de barbacoa in particular. Just leave it at that. There's some just really beautiful scenes around that involve some of your own family members. At this point, I'm going to start taking some of the questions from the audience. Again, if you have a question, please drop it in the Q&A. We do have several already, a handful. So let me start with that. The first question is from Steph Noel, and it's, what is your favorite dish that represents the confluence of cultures in Texas and Mexico?
Well, I think nopalitos is everywhere, certainly in Texas and Mexico. So nopalitos certainly would be experienced in both places. I'm going to stick to very elemental servings rather than going through enchiladas or mole or things like that. So I will say the nopalitos with eggs in the morning, because we had quail eggs. And then the second thing is, I would say the corn tortilla, just off the comal, steaming, with freshly sliced avocado slices and a little bit of salt to pump up the flavor. You make a taco. That to me is incredible. It's caviar, as to make an example. It's really delicious. So I would say it's those ingredients that have been around here for millennia, both in Texas and south of the river. There are many others. There's horchata. There's many.
Now, another question that was dropped into the chat, and it's also, I think, a comment supporting some of the arguments you're making, but it's, why define ourselves by colonial terms of Texas and Mexico, rather than talking about the geographies as identified by indigenous peoples?
Yes, and we shouldn't. I don't think that we should ever explain who we are or what our food is by making references to European constructs, to the received categories that we talk about all of the time. So that's why I was saying earlier, we chose Texas Mexican, because these are indigenous terms. It is a Tejas land, it is the Tejas culture, and it is the Tejas understanding of Mother Earth and how we should take care of Mother Earth, therefore cook in a certain way. The Mexica, Mexico also. So I agree with you that as much as we can, begin to tell our stories. Antonia Castañeda from San Antonio puts it really well, and I quote her in this book. She says, have the confidence to tell your stories and to have faith in your experience individually and that of your community. I think that's beautiful.
That is beautiful. And it's hard when we were raised not to have confidence in those experiences and not to have those experiences be public or be named. And so that's part of what something like film can help to do, right? Is that life that we considered private in the home that we didn't talk about outside the home is now circulating. And it's something that gives, that validates our own notions of the world and our own experiences. So relatedly, we have a question from Josue Trevino, who said, looking through that lens of our geopolitical history in South Texas and what's been ignored and forgotten and even rewritten, what food or ingredient has been the most pushed aside or forgotten? What ingredients do you feel have the ability to speak out the loudest in our erased history?
What a beautiful question. I love it. This speak through our food. And we've been doing this for centuries of colonization. That's it. So looking at San Antonio, South Texas, Coahuila, I would say the nopalitos are very strong. Begin to see how mesquite was used. Cabeza de Vaca tells us this in his book, that we used it to make porridge, and I use it to make cookies. I would say what has been looked down upon that we could really shout from the mountaintops, I think is your question. Yeah. What has been looked down upon? I would say beans and chile. So stereotypic foods. And I'll tell you a story of how this whole thing started. I was at the CIA, and we're talking about beans. I was at the CIA, pinto beans. And it's regional cuisine. They had mentioned Tex-Mex in the text, but we had to cook these recipes, and it's Southwest, and it's refried beans. So I got a skillet and sartén, cast iron, and I boiled the beans and I put them in there, and I said to the chef, professor, that I didn't want to use the blender. It's a Vitamix, and it's really fast, and it has a motor you could run your lawnmower on, because it'll turn it into a puree. So I said, I need a masher, and he said, get with it, Adán. It's the 20th century. Turn it on. So I didn't, and I walked around. I could not find a masher, so I got a can and started mashing the beans on the sartén with the can. Because when you do it that way, you have little flakes, and you've got texture. It's that mouthfeel that women invented. It's the way to eat beans. And then you take the spatula and you roast the beans on the pan. Number one, you're caramelizing the starch in the beans, so it's going to get flavor, the caramelization. And number two, there's a thing called Maillard reaction, which is the same chemical thing but with protein. And the beans have protein, so that also changes the molecular structure of the beans. And so the beans come out, and they're delicious. You take the, I was doing this, and the chef came over and he says, and he looked at it, and he understood that it was important, and which is a credit to the CIA. They didn't know about this, but as soon as they knew about it, they went on with it. And he said, so it's not just puree of beans. I said, no, it's not just puree of beans. This is a technique. The Texas Mexican food becomes delicious, not just through ingredients, but through technique.
Through technique as well. Yeah, great point. Another question from Kathleen Vermeulen. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing your last name. I apologize. She says, I'm a teacher and have been trying to find recipes to introduce my young students to the culture of the local Native American cuisine and have really struggled. I end up finding a smattering of bastardized concepts across the US. Where can I find authentic yet feasible information?
What a great question. That's what it's all about. Our film is now being licensed to colleges and universities. We've been licensed by the University of Toronto, Iberoamericana, other places in Texas. So if you're a university professor listening, please give me a call and will license it for the use of your students. I recommend the work at the University of Texas at San Antonio of, oh my goodness, you can help me out with this. She is teaching a course on this food, Liliana Patricia Saldana, and she's on Facebook. I guess I could, it's Liliana, Liliana Patricia Saldana. And she would be able to help with study guides and all kinds of, in fact, she with another professor have created the study guide that we are using for our film. So I would recommend her work. Also the Tapilam community, which is in our film, we feature them in our film. They have an annual dinner, and they focus on Native American foods, and the entire dinner, they call it the Cactus Blossom Dinner. I would go to that and I would talk to them about it and see how maybe your students could go to that or have some relationship. And there are probably other things that I could mention, but that's, those are two. But that's a great question. We need to do more of this. And I think the bottom line of this is not, okay, we're going to take over Tex-Mex, now we're winning. The whole point of this is not to say, I have been erased, I have been oppressed, now it's my turn to be in charge and I'm going to be the big guy. That is the old concept of encounter. That's not the encounter we want. The encounter is so that both of us heal. And the reason I want you to learn about this food is that it's delicious and it's beautiful. You will have a pleasurable experience. And the more of us make beautiful food of all cultures, the more beautiful and peaceful the world will be, because it connects us to one another.
Wow, I love that. Very beautiful idea of creating peace through food. We have a few questions from Josh Human, and he says, does Texas Mexican cuisine depend upon trendy ingredients like huitlacoche, chile de árbol, and agave? Are there any ingredients that are unique in Texas Mexican comida casera? And what's one of the best things you've eaten?
Okay. By the way, Josh, thank you for coming. He hosted one of my dinners and presentations at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. It was a wonderful event. I think that some people will begin to do trendy things. I think, for example, barbacoa. Barbacoa is one of our delicacies, but it was survival food. In the film, we do a centerpiece is the making of the barbacoa. It's a performance art of folklore cuisine. And this was the cow's head that was thrown away, desecha, era desecha. And we had to eat it or starve. And we made beautiful things out of dispossession. And now chefs are doing barbacoa in fine dining restaurants. So it's happening. They're doing this, but the one thing I would say, and if you read my books, it's also the main front and center of the movie. Food divorced from culture has no legs. So if you take the food away from the culture, from the hospitality, from my mom actually holding me, giving it, this is the context of food. Otherwise it becomes a fetish. It's the thing, you know, when you, it's so boring. But you take food as what it is. It's Mother Earth taking care of you, which begs the question, how shall I take care of Mother Earth? Which brings in sourcing. How do you source so that the environment is not damaged the way we're damaging it? It's a full understanding of food.
Thank you, Adán. The next question is from Edmund Tijerina, who I know from our years at the San Antonio Express News as journalist, and apparently you know him too. He said, hello, Adán and Cecilia, two wonderful people who I'm proud to call friends. Here's my question. Where in the conversation between Texas Mexican and Tex-Mex do the Mexican-American restaurateurs and home cooks who serve and enjoy both comida casera and greasy, cheesy dishes fit? I think of how families in San Antonio who came to the US during the revolution, mine among them, later proudly embraced both types of cuisine.
I would say that many of the, two things, many of the dishes that we call Tex-Mex, I would not categorize as Tex-Mex. I would categorize as Texas Mexican. One of those things being nachos. Everyone thinks nachos are Tex-Mex. Nachos were invented by a Texas Mexican culinary in El Paso. In Eagle Pass. So I think if you go to comida casera, you will rarely find puffy tacos. You will rarely find carne guisada that has yellow cheese over it. In fact, my mother, una chancla, ¿por qué le estás poniendo queso a la carne guisada? Why are you putting cheese on my carne guisada? So there are those things. But I would say the combination comes here. Some of my favorite restaurants in Houston are Sylvia's Enchilada Kitchen, and she does not use the term Tex-Mex in any of her dishes. She uses the Tex-Mex in one of the explanations, because if you want to compete as a restaurateur in Texas, you have to use the term Tex-Mex, because that is the predominant category that people traveling here will want to eat. And this is because the writers of the 60s and 70s invented the term, took up the term from the railroaders, Tex-Mex, and just made it the term to talk about this food. So if you want to be a successful, trendy restaurant, you have to use the term, unfortunately. And but if you go to the other places in San Antonio, all over the valley, not a single one of them will call themselves Tex-Mex.
Interesting.
Nor here in Houston. If you go to the family restaurants about which I'm talking about, none of them have Tex-Mex in the name. Only Chuy's Tex-Mex, these larger Anglo-run, or Gringo's Tex-Mex. Of course, Gringo's Tex-Mex in Houston is run by a Latino.
Right.
He's chosen that format. And as I say, they're different formats, they're different foods. But so thanks for the question, Edmund.
And related to that, Todd Romero, he said, Alan, thank you so much for your work in print and film. Can you talk about a few dishes that you see as some of the richest examples of Texas comida casera? I know you've talked about nopales and a few other things, barbacoa. Can you give us a few more examples? And while it is a living tradition that flows from Texas Mexican homes, do restaurants have a role in keeping it vital?
Thank you. Yes. I encourage all of us to support the family-run Mexican restaurants. In San Antonio, there's many of them on the west side, on the south side. Support them, and then as this food gets to be more recognized, its price is going to go up, which is a good thing for restaurateurs, and we need to do that. I would say the dishes are carne guisada, yum. Carne guisada belongs to this region. You don't have carne guisada in other regions of Mexico. Carne guisada, of course, our arroz con pollo is very unique from the other arroz con pollos because we use garlic, cumin, and black pepper for that aroma. I would use that. I would say calabacita con pollo, also the squash. Squash is very much part of our tradition. Chile verde, chile serrano, just plain, straight would be good. I could go on, tostadas with and shrimp and deer. Anyway, there's a lot. This is delicious. I'm getting hungry.
I am too. It's past our dinner time. Okay, Adán, there's been a question from early on from someone who's asking, have you gotten a reply from the state of Texas about the historical marker at the Corpus Christi Bridge? Is that something in your film?
Thank you for bringing that up. I'm glad. I stand up in the film. The film has a narrative arc which reaches a climax to the words of Graciela Sanchez from the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center. And she says, "We live in a racist society. We have been erased." That's the climax. And I stand up in front of the camera and I ask the historians who live among us in Texas to tell the study commission, the Texas Historical Commission, to take down that plaque that says that Carancawas were cannibals, that they disappeared. They're still there. No, I haven't heard from them, but I will tell you, I was invited the January before COVID began in 1920. I was invited to deliver the opening night keynote address to the Texas Historical Commission annual convention, which I did. and they ate this delicious food we're talking about. But this didn't come up.
No.
This didn't come up at the dinner table, and I just wanted them to see the film rather than hear it from me and see if anything happens. I would like for it to be taken down.
Thank you, Adán. And unfortunately, I'm only going to be able to bring you one more question because we're out of time. We had a few more that we didn't get to, and I apologize. But Margaret Dudley asked, how do you foresee the history of indigenous Texas Mexican food changing as it mixes with American mainstream cooking? As you've explained, the history of this cuisine is marked by incorporation of other elements from, say, Europe. But do you believe this will change the cuisine at a fundamental level at some point?
This is great. This is great. It's already 8 o'clock. I don't know how to answer. So stop me when I need to stop. But this is a big question. The Texas Mexican cuisine, like the other regional cuisines of the larger Mexican gastronomy, will always retain its character. But it will change. Its character will change. And that's what we talked about earlier, that plants do not have, that food does not have nationality. It has roots. And we could talk about Texas Mexican food as world food as well. So the short answer is yes, it will change as all foods change. Oaxaca Mexican food will change. Chinese food will change. Italian food will change. Italian food has changed thanks to the Mexican gastronomy. What would Italians do without the Mexican tomato? So we did change the Italian cuisine fundamentally, as we did the French as well. So we are looking at food in a different way if we don't look at it as nationalistic processes, but rather as landscape and Mother Earth feeding the people of the earth, wherever they may be.
Okay, well, with that, I'm unfortunately gonna have to wrap it up and pass it back to Eric. But don't forget to look for the movie, Google Truly Texas Mexican. That's easy enough to remember, and you'll find a multitude of ways to get it. It's really worth your time. It's a very beautiful film. Thank you, Eric.
Adán, Cecilia, thank you so much. That's a wonderful conversation, and it's a privilege to host it. Thank you for your time and for your insight, both of you, this evening, and for your work. So everyone else, thank you for joining us. We will. We're happy to share the recording of this, and also we look forward to transcribing the piece so that we can share it more broadly, because really this has been just a remarkable conversation. So thank you, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you at another Humanities Texas or Texas Foodways program soon. Good night.